My aunt mocked. My name is Sophia Kingston, and at the age of 32, I inherited an empire, not of land or jewels, but of trade routes and cargo ships, of ledgers and contracts that crisscrossed the globe. My father had built Kingston Global Trading from a single ship into a behemoth, and his sudden passing left it all in my hands. The world, and more pressingly my own family, held its breath, waiting to see if the heiress would sink or swim. But the true challenge wasn't navigating the complexities of international commerce. It was navigating the even more treacherous waters of my own heart, or so everyone seemed to believe. I was being courted, very publicly, by two of the most talked about men in the city, and the pressure to choose was immense. It was a choice that would lead to a disastrous and expensive test, a public corporate showdown, and the quietest, most unexpected love story you could imagine. Before I reveal how a man who never raised his voice saved the company from two men who did little else, I'd love it if you let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt like your judgment was being questioned by the people who should have trusted you the most, go ahead and hit that like button. Now let's get into the story of the captain, the poet, and the man no one ever saw coming. The weight of my father's legacy settled on me the first time I walked into the boardroom as its new head. The room itself felt heavy, paneled and dark, imposing mahogany that had absorbed decades of cigar smoke and tense negotiations. A colossal portrait of my father, his gaze stern and appraising even in oil paint, dominated the far wall. It felt less like an homage and more like a warning. The board members, a collection of men my father's age with faces like ancient maps, offered condolences that sounded more like veiled assessments. They saw a daughter, a woman, an unknown quantity at the helm of their very predictable, very profitable world. I knew I had to prove myself, not just competent, but formidable. The business itself, the intricate dance of logistics and finance, didn't frighten me. I had grown up with it. My bedtime stories were tales of commodity futures and maritime law. The numbers in a ledger were clearer to me than any poem, the logic of a supply chain more beautiful than any sonnet. What I was not prepared for was the social machinery that immediately whirred to life around me, orchestrated by my well-meaning but hopelessly romantic Aunt Beatrice and my Uncle Philip, whose primary business acumen involved judging the quality of port at the club. They had decided, with the unshakable certainty of the socially obsessed, that the best way to secure the company's future was for me to secure a husband. Not just any husband, but a man of presence, of stature, a man who could stand beside me and in their eyes lend me the gravitas I supposedly lacked. And they had found two perfect candidates. The first was Captain Alexander Valerius, a man who seemed to have sailed directly out of a seafaring epic. He was impossibly handsome, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a laugh that boomed with the confidence of a man who had faced down tempests and pirates. He was a master storyteller, and at the dinner parties my aunt insisted on hosting, he held the entire table captive. He would speak of rounding Cape Horn in a gale, of navigating treacherous archipelagos by starlight, of negotiating with fierce port masters in forgotten corners of the world. My family was utterly enchanted. Such strength, such decisiveness. Aunt Beatrice would whisper to me, her eyes gleaming, "He understands our world, Sophia. He has salt in his veins, just like your dear father." I would listen politely, but my mind was always working on a different level. One evening, as he was finishing a particularly thrilling tale about outrunning a sudden squall, I decided to probe. "It sounds terrifying, Captain. What was the insurance protocol for the cargo? Did the policy cover damages from unpredicted weather events, or was it classified as an act of God, leaving your client liable?" The question hung in the air, a cold, practical piece of metal in a room filled with warm, fragrant steam. Captain Valerius paused, his swashbuckling narrative punctured. He then let out that booming laugh, a deflection as masterful as any sailing maneuver. "My dear Sophia, always the pragmatist, One does not think of paperwork when the wind is tearing at the sails. One thinks of survival, of victory. The cargo, of course, was fine. It always is when Valerius is at the helm. He winked, and the table erupted in appreciative laughter. My Uncle Philip slapped his knee. That's the spirit, a man of action, not a pen pusher. But I saw a flicker of something in the captain's eyes, a brief telling annoyance at being pulled from his glorious story into the mundane world of consequence and liability. I looked across the room and my eyes met those of Marcus Cole, my secretary. He was standing discreetly by the wall, a notepad in hand as always, and he gave me the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was a shared moment of understanding. He had heard what I had heard, a beautiful story with a hole in its hull. The second suitor was Lysander Jones, a poet whose family had old money and even older connections. Where the captain was all storm and sea spray, Lysander was gentle mist and quiet harbors. He was slender and thoughtful, with dark brooding eyes and a voice that could make a grocery list sound like a tragic ode. He didn't speak of storms, but of the soul of commerce and the beauty of the artisan's hand. He would attend my aunt's salons, and instead of telling stories, he would recite poetry, often his own, dedicated to me. He compared my eyes to rare sapphires from Ceylon, my hair to spun silk from the Orient. My family, especially Aunt Beatrice, would practically melt. "Oh, Sophia, such a sensitive heart," she would sigh, dabbing a lace handkerchief at her eyes. "A man who sees the beauty in the world, who can elevate business beyond mere profit. He would bring such culture, such refinement to the company." During one such gathering, after Lysander had finished a particularly florid sonnet about the loom and the sea, I tried my own practical approach. "That was lovely, Lysander. You speak of beauty and craft. If you were to take a role in the company, what would your 5-year strategic vision be for, say, our textile import division?" Lysander smiled, a dreamy, faraway smile. "Vision, my dear Sophia, a 5-year plan is a cage for the spirit. My vision is not one of spreadsheets and projections, but is to cultivate beauty, to nurture the corporate soul. We would ensure every weaver is happy, every shipment is blessed, every customer feels the poetry in the fabric they purchase. We would build a business that is in itself a work of art." My uncle nodded sagely. Profound, truly profound. I, on the other hand, felt a familiar tension building behind my eyes. It was a beautiful sentiment, but it was also a business philosophy that would lead to bankruptcy in 6 months. Again, I glanced at Marcus, who was discreetly pouring water for the guests. His expression was a perfect mask of professional neutrality, but I knew him well enough to see the microscopic tightening around his mouth. He knew, as I did, that you couldn't pay suppliers with poetry. These evenings became a form of exquisite torture. My family saw 2 perfect potential husbands. I saw 2 enormous potential liabilities. Captain Valerius saw business as a grand adventure, a series of heroic gambles where the details were tiresome trifles. Lysander Jones saw business as a canvas for his artistic sensibilities, where profit and logistics were vulgar distractions from the pursuit of beauty. Neither seemed to understand the core of what my father had built, a complex, delicate machine that ran on diligence, foresight, and an obsessive attention to detail. They saw the ship, but not the engine room. They saw the silk, but not the supply chain. My only island of sanity in this sea of romance and bravado was Marcus Cole. He had been my father's executive secretary for 15 years, and now he was mine. Marcus was the opposite of my suitors in every conceivable way. He was of average height and build, with neat brown hair and quiet gray eyes behind simple, functional glasses. He dressed in unassuming gray suits and spoke in a calm, measured tone. He was utterly invisible to my family. To them, he was just part of the furniture, a silent functionary who appeared with a folder when needed and disappeared just as quietly. But to me, he was the company's memory and its conscience. He knew every contract, every key player, every potential pitfall in every market. He didn't offer opinions unless asked, But when he did, they were backed by data and a deep historical understanding of our operations. Our daily briefings were the most intellectually stimulating part of my day. He would lay out a complex arbitrage opportunity in the coffee bean market, his explanation concise and brilliant. If we divert the shipment from Hamburg to Antwerp, we can take advantage of the spot price difference, but we risk a 2-day delay. However, the weather forecast for the North Sea is clear for the next 4 days, giving us a 96% probability of arriving on time. The potential upside is a 7% increase in net profit on the consignment. It was like listening to music. There was no bluster, no poetry, just the elegant, irrefutable logic of a well-run business. Do it, I'd say, and he would simply nod. Already drafted the orders, Sophia, just waiting for your sign-off. In those moments, I felt a connection far deeper than any I felt during a flowery sonnet or a tall tale of the sea. It was a partnership of minds, a shared respect for competence. The pressure from my family was becoming unbearable. The board, too, was getting restless, whispering about the need for a strong man to help guide me. I was being pushed into a corner, and my pragmatic mind rebelled against the idea of making such a critical decision based on dinner party charm. I needed data. I needed to see these men in action, to strip away the romance and the bravado and see the raw material underneath. And so, in the quiet of my office late one night, as Marcus was preparing the next day's docket, the idea came to me. It was audacious, unconventional, and perfectly ruthlessly logical. Marcus, I said, leaning back in my chair, I'm going to give them a test. He looked up, his gray eyes curious. A test? Yes, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. My family wants them to prove they are worthy of my hand. I want them to prove they are not going to destroy my company. I'm going to give each of them a struggling division to manage. A week later, I called a formal meeting in the grand mahogany-paneled boardroom. Captain Valerius and Lysander Jones sat on one side of the vast table, looking expectant and slightly confused. My aunt and uncle sat on the other side, beaming with pride, assuming this was some kind of formal courtship announcement. The board members sat silently, their faces unreadable. I stood at the head of the table, my father's portrait at my back. I felt its weight, but for the first time, it felt like a source of strength, not judgment. Gentlemen, I began, my voice steady and clear, you have both expressed a keen interest in the future of Kingston Global Trading and in my own. I believe that true partnership is built not on words, but on action. Therefore, I am offering each of you an opportunity to demonstrate your capabilities. I gestured to Marcus, who placed 2 thick binders on the table. We have 2 divisions that have been underperforming. The first is Kingston Maritime Logistics. It's facing challenges with an aging fleet, high fuel costs, and difficult union negotiations. I looked directly at Captain Valerius. His eyes lit up, a predatory gleam in them. The second division is Kingston Artisanal Imports. It struggles with inconsistent supply chains, high overhead, and thin profit margins in a very competitive luxury market. My gaze shifted to Lysander. His expression softened into one of intrigued contemplation. I am offering each of you full operational autonomy over one of these divisions for a trial period of 6 months, I announced. You will have a generous but fixed budget. Your goal is to make the division profitable, or at the very least to present a viable plan for its long-term profitability. Before they could speak, Captain Valerius slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. Maritime logistics. It's a fleet without a captain, a ship without a hand on the tiller. I accept. I will whip that division into shape before the next tide. His bravado filled the room. Uncle Philip chuckled in admiration. Lysander smiled serenely. Then the artisanal imports division shall be my charge. Beauty must beget beauty. We shall not seek mere profit, but trade in splendor and enrich the world. It would be my honor. Aunt Beatrice clasped her hands together in delight. It's like a grand tournament, a quest for the princess's hand, she whispered far too loudly. I held up a hand for silence. There is one final condition, I said, my voice cutting through the romantic haze. All progress reports, financial statements, and strategic updates will be submitted weekly, not to me directly, but to Mr. Cole. He will collate the data and present it to me in our regular briefings. I saw a flicker of surprise on their faces. They had expected to have my ear, to charm their way through their reports. Instead, they were being handed over to the quiet man in gray, the man who dealt only in facts. The family thought it a quaint administrative detail. The board members exchanged glances, a new grudging respect dawning in their eyes. Captain Valerius and Lysander Jones saw a functionary, but I had just placed my most trusted knight on the board, right at the center of the game. The test had begun. The first month of the test was a whirlwind of public relations triumphs for my two suitors. Captain Valerius strode into Kingston Maritime Logistics like a conquering hero. He gave rousing, salty speeches to the dock workers and ship crews, promising them a return to glory. He was photographed for the financial pages, his hand confidently on the helm of a cargo ship, the wind whipping through his hair. His first major move was to announce a bold, aggressive new strategy. He would cease all our smaller, less glamorous shipping routes and consolidate the division's resources into one massive gamble, cornering the nascent market for refrigerated shipping to a newly opened resource-rich port in South America. It was a high-risk, high-reward play that made the markets buzz. At our family dinners, he would paint a vivid picture of the riches to be had, of ships laden with exotic fruits and rare minerals. "Fortune favors the bold, Sophia," he'd declare, raising a glass. "While others nibble at the edges, we shall feast at the center of the table." Marcus's first report on the captain's progress was, as always, meticulously neutral. It detailed the press coverage and the initial surge in divisional morale, but it also contained a section titled Risk Analysis that made my blood run cold. It highlighted the massive front-loaded capital expenditure required to refit the ships for refrigerated cargo, the complete lack of diplomatic and commercial infrastructure at the destination port, and the absence of any contingency plans or alternative routes. Marcus had included a chart showing the division's cash burn rate. It was a nearly vertical line. My internal thought was stark and simple. He's betting the entire division on a single roll of the dice. Meanwhile, over at Kingston Artisanal Imports, Lysander Jones was undertaking a revolution of the soul. His first act was not to analyze supply chains, but to hire a team of expensive designers to completely remodel the offices into what he called an oasis of creative commerce. The drab cubicles were replaced with open spaces, flowing curtains, and art installations. He instituted a mandatory poetry hour every afternoon, where employees were encouraged to share their feelings. His most celebrated move was to scrap our functional, cost-effective packaging and commission an acclaimed artist to design new boxes for our imported silks. Each box was a work of art in itself, embossed with gold leaf and lined with velvet. The lifestyle magazines and society blogs adored it. They ran glossy spreads praising Lysander's humane approach to business and his commitment to aesthetic capitalism. He was hailed as a visionary. My Aunt Beatrice was so proud she had one of the articles framed, but when Marcus's first report from Artisanal Imports landed on my desk, it told a very different story. The first page was a summary of the glowing press. The second page was a cold, hard spreadsheet. Office renovation over budget by 300%, new packaging costs, an increase of 800% per unit, completely erasing the product's profit margin. And a new line item that made me stare in disbelief: poetic inspiration and morale, which included the hiring of a resident sitar player for the warehouse. The report noted a 200% increase in overhead and operational expenses in the first 30 days alone. There was, of course, no corresponding increase in sales. My thought was equally grim: he's redecorating the ballroom on the Titanic. By the end of the second month, the first cracks in their beautiful facades began to show. A minor geopolitical skirmish broke out near Captain Valerius's chosen South American port. A new nationalist government, wary of foreign influence, slapped an enormous, unexpected tariff on all incoming refrigerated goods. The news sent a shockwave through the commodities market. Valerius's entire grand venture was now stalled, his ships anchored miles offshore, racking up astronomical daily fees, while the cargo in their holds edged closer to spoiling. A prudent manager would have cut his losses, recalled the ships, and sought to renegotiate or pivot. Captain Valerius, however, saw it as a personal challenge, an affront to his will. He doubled down. He began pouring the division's remaining cash reserves into hiring expensive local fixers and lobbyists, convinced he could personally persuade the new government to see reason. His weekly reports to Marcus, which had been boastful and grand, became vague and evasive. He started talking about temporary logistical headwinds and navigating complex political currents. I decided to confront him at the next family dinner. I kept my tone level and professional. "Alexander," I said, using his first name to soften the blow. "Mr. Cole's report indicates a significant cash flow problem at Maritime Logistics due to the tariff issue. What is your plan to mitigate the daily losses?" He waved a dismissive hand, the charming smile never leaving his face. "A little turbulence, my dear Sophia. Nothing more. Every great voyage encounters a patch of rough water. A true captain doesn't turn back at the first sign of a squall. He steers right into it. It requires nerve." Uncle Philip nodded vigorously. "Nerve, that's what your father had, by Jove." Aunt Beatrice looked at him with adoration. "So decisive. He's not afraid to take charge." I felt a cold knot of anger tighten in my stomach. They were praising the very recklessness that was about to sink an entire division of my company. He wasn't being decisive. He was being stubborn. He wasn't a captain steering into a storm. He was an addict placing one last bet to win back his losses. Lysander's disaster was quieter, but no less complete. The beautiful, expensive packaging was so complex to assemble that it had created a massive bottleneck in the warehouse. Shipments were delayed by weeks. His focus on aesthetics had completely ignored the practicalities of logistics. Our most important clients, high-end department stores and boutique hotels, were furious. They didn't care about gold leaf boxes. They cared about receiving their silk bolts and Belgian lace on time for their seasonal collections. To combat the growing crisis and what he called a crisis of corporate spirit, Lysander decided the best course of action was a mandatory 3-day company retreat to a lavish countryside estate to realign their creative energies and workshop their feelings about the supply chain. While his employees were practicing truss falls and writing collaborative haikus, a massive time-sensitive shipment of artisanal cheeses from France and rare orchids from Thailand sat in a non-refrigerated section of the warehouse, forgotten in the administrative chaos. It all spoiled. The entire shipment had to be written off. Marcus's report on the incident was devastating in its quiet precision. It included the total cost of the spoiled goods, the cost of the corporate retreat, and copies of 3 fuming emails from major clients terminating their contracts. I decided to visit the Artisanal Imports office myself. It was, as the magazines had promised, beautiful. The air was scented with expensive candles, and the gentle notes of the sitar player echoed from the warehouse. But the phones were ringing incessantly, and the few employees not at the retreat looked stressed and miserable. Lysander greeted me with a serene smile, seemingly oblivious to the chaos. He was more excited to show me a new sonnet he had composed, inspired by the recent events. "I call it Ode to Impermanence," he said, his eyes shining. "It's about the tragic, fleeting beauty of commerce, how the cheese, in its decay, has returned to the earth, completing its cycle." I had to physically restrain myself from snatching the piece of paper out of his hand and shredding it. He wasn't a manager. He was a child playing with his father's expensive toys. The contrast between these public disasters and my private work sessions with Marcus became more pronounced with each passing week. Late at night, long after the rest of the building had gone dark, we would be in my office, the vast mahogany desk covered in the real ledgers and reports. The numbers told a story far more compelling than any sea shanty or sonnet. Marcus, with his quiet competence, had become my indispensable partner in navigating the mess. He wasn't just a reporter of bad news. He was a strategist. He created alternate financial models, detailed projections that showed what should have been done. One night, pointing to the maritime logistics spreadsheet, he said softly, If Captain Valerius had hedged his investment, perhaps by upgrading 2 ships for the new route while sending the other 4 on established profitable routes, the tariff would have been a manageable loss, a setback, not a catastrophe. The division could have absorbed it. His logic was impeccable. A few nights later, reviewing the artisanal imports disaster, he laid out another scenario. The budget for the new packaging and the corporate retreat, he began, his voice devoid of judgment but full of fact, was more than enough to have upgraded the warehouse's cold storage capacity and implemented a new inventory tracking system. According to my projections, those 2 investments would have increased efficiency by 40% and put the division on a path to a 15% net profit within 2 quarters. In these quiet late-night sessions, surrounded by the stark reality of numbers, I saw the man my family couldn't. I saw his brilliant mind, his unwavering diligence, his deep, unspoken loyalty to the company my father had built. He never said, "I told you so." He never criticized my suitors directly. He simply presented the data, the unvarnished truth, and allowed me to draw my own conclusions. There were no grand gestures, no declarations, but a bond was forming between us, forged in the crucible of shared purpose and mutual respect. I came to rely not just on his analysis, but on his calm presence in the midst of the escalating chaos. I began to realize that while the captain and the poet were trying to win my hand, Marcus Cole was quietly helping me save my company, and I started to wonder which of those was the truer form of love. The 6-month trial period was drawing to a close, and I knew the time for a final reckoning was at hand. The day of the final review arrived, gray and overcast, the sky mirroring the mood I felt inside. I had called a full board meeting. The long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces of the board members. My Aunt Beatrice and Uncle Philip were also present, as their significant shareholdings gave them a right to be there. They, however, looked expectant, as if they were attending the finale of a thrilling horse race. Captain Valerius and Lysander Jones sat on one side of the table. Valerius looked tanned, confident, and unruffled, a man who believed his charisma could bend reality to his will. Lysander appeared melancholic and thoughtful, as if he were preparing to deliver a eulogy for a fallen comrade rather than a business report. Both of them, I suspected, still believed they could talk their way out of the abyss they had dug. I stood at the head of the table, my father's portrait a silent, imposing witness behind me. Marcus sat to my right, a slim laptop in front of him, his demeanor as calm and steady as a ship's anchor in a calm sea. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice resonating in the quiet room, "6 months ago, I entrusted you both with the stewardship of a part of this company. Today we are here to review the results of your efforts. Captain Valerius, you may begin." The captain stood, a magnetic smile on his face. He strode to the front of the room, using a large map and a series of dramatic charts to illustrate his presentation. He spoke not of the catastrophic losses, but of strategic headwinds and boldly charting new territories. He framed the crippling tariffs as a temporary political squall that would soon pass. He described his fleet, still anchored in bleeding money, as a powerful forward presence, poised to dominate the market the moment the weather clears. His conclusion was as audacious as his initial gamble. "What maritime logistics requires now," he boomed, his eyes sweeping across the board, "is not retreat, but reinforcement, a further injection of capital to see this courageous voyage through to its glorious, profitable conclusion." He finished with a flourish, and my Uncle Philip actually applauded. "Bravo! Fortune favors the bold after all," he exclaimed, looking around for agreement. A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then it was Lysander's turn. He did not stand. He remained seated, his hands clasped before him, and spoke in his soft, lyrical voice. He used no charts or maps. He spoke of the journey of Kingston artisanal imports under his tenure as a spiritual quest. He talked about the increased happiness and creative fulfillment of his employees. He even framed the write-off of the spoiled cheese and orchids as a necessary, beautiful sacrifice to the gods of commerce, a reminder that not all value can be captured on a balance sheet. He finished not with a business proposal, but by reading a short, tragic poem he had written about a lonely, misunderstood silk merchant. His closing request was for more funds, not to improve logistics or secure new clients, but to continue cultivating a humanistic workspace where the soul of commerce can flourish. Aunt Beatrice was openly weeping. "Such a sensitive, profound man," she whispered to me, clutching my arm. "He puts people and beauty before vulgar profit. He has a poet's heart." The room was thick with a mixture of misplaced sentimentality and palpable financial anxiety. I let the silence hang for a moment before I rose to my feet. "Thank you both for your presentations," I said, my voice cold and clear. The word presentations hung in the air, imbued with all the skepticism I felt. "Your passion is undeniable. However, this board is not in the business of funding heroic gambles or subsidizing poetry workshops. We are here to steward a legacy of sound, sustainable commerce, a legacy built on diligence and prudence." The atmosphere in the room shifted. My aunt's tears stopped. My uncle's cheerful expression faded. I looked at Captain Valerius and Lysander Jones, their confident and sorrowful masks beginning to crack. "You were given a simple task, to take a struggling division and guide it toward profitability. You were given generous resources and my full support. What I required in return was not bravado or beauty, but competence." I paused, then gave a small, sharp nod to Marcus. The large screen behind me, which the captain had used for his dramatic maps, flickered to life, but there were no maps on it now. Marcus, without a word, projected his own slides. They were stark, simple, and utterly brutal. The first slide showed two line graphs side by side, one for maritime logistics, one for artisanal imports. Both lines started at the top left of the screen and plunged, with terrifying speed, to the bottom right. The next slide showed cash flow charts, vast columns of red ink that represented the money they had burned through. Another slide showed their operational expenditures compared to industry benchmarks. Their costs were astronomical, wildly out of sync with any functional business. Marcus moved through the slides with silent, devastating efficiency. The data was irrefutable. The family's romantic notions and the suitor's grand narratives evaporated in the cold, hard light of the facts. The room was utterly deathly silent. While these experiments were underway, I continued, my voice cutting through the stillness. I tasked Mr. Cole with a different project. He was to analyze the same challenges and draft a viable recovery plan for both divisions, based not on hope or aesthetics, but on the actual market conditions we face. Marcus clicked to his final two slides. The first was a detailed multi-phase plan for maritime logistics. It involved cutting losses by recalling the fleet, selling two of the oldest ships to finance upgrades on the others, and refocusing on a diversified portfolio of smaller, less glamorous, but consistently profitable contracts. It was a plan built on risk mitigation and efficiency. The second slide detailed the recovery of artisanal imports. It involved renegotiating with suppliers, investing in a modest but effective cold chain logistics system, and streamlining the packaging to be both elegant and cost-effective. Each plan was supported by meticulous financial projections, showing a clear, believable path back to profitability within 18 months. They were not exciting plans. They were not poetic. They were simply brilliant. I let the image of Marcus's competent, logical plan sink in. Then I turned my gaze to my two suitors. Their faces were pale with shock and dawning humiliation. "Captain Valerius, Mr. Jones, your management tenures are terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." I then looked at the stunned faces of the board members and my family. "And I am announcing the creation of a new position at this company, that of Chief Operating Officer. The role will be filled by the man who has demonstrated more strategic vision, financial acumen, and quiet dedication in the last 6 months than anyone I have ever met. I am promoting Marcus Cole to COO of Kingston Global Trading, effective immediately." A collective gasp went through the room. But I wasn't finished. I held up my hand to forestall the questions. I looked across the room, past the board, past my family, and met Marcus's steady gray eyes. A flicker of surprise, the first I had ever seen, crossed his face. I gave him a small, reassuring smile. Then I turned back to the room. And one final piece of business. I have accepted his proposal of marriage. That was the one that broke the spell. The silence shattered. Captain Valerius sputtered, his face crimson with wounded pride. Lysander looked as if he had been physically struck, a mask of tragic betrayal on his face. And my Aunt Beatrice, true to form, let out a small squeak and fainted dead away into my uncle's lap. In the ensuing chaos, Marcus Cole rose from his chair, walked calmly to my side, and quietly, firmly, took my hand in his. It was the most eloquent statement in the room. The boardroom emptied in a flurry of shocked whispers and frantic activity as my uncle tried to revive my aunt. Captain Valerius and Lysander Jones were gone, their blustering and poetic exits equally pathetic. I was left standing in the silent mahogany-paneled room with Marcus. The scent of my aunt's lavender smelling salts still hung in the air. "Sophia," Marcus said, his voice quiet but laced with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. "You didn't have to announce it all like that. The promotion, and the other thing." I turned to him and allowed myself a real smile, the first one that day that wasn't tinged with iron. "Yes, Marcus, I did," I replied. "It was the most efficient way to terminate 2 bad business deals, solve a succession crisis, and secure a life partner all in one go. Entirely pragmatic, you see." For the first time, I saw him truly relax. The professional mantle he always wore slipped away, and a warm, genuine smile lit up his face, transforming his features. "Pragmatic," he echoed, shaking his head slightly in amusement. Of course, the proposal he was referring to hadn't been a grand affair. There was no bended knee or velvet box. It had happened a week before the board meeting, late one night in my office. We were reviewing his final recovery plans, and I had been overwhelmed by the sheer elegance and intelligence of his work. "Marcus," I had said, looking up from a particularly brilliant logistics schedule, "you've saved them, both of them. You've saved me from having to liquidate 2 entire divisions." He had looked down at the papers, a rare flush creeping up his neck. "I'm just doing my job, Sophia, serving the company." "No," I insisted, my voice softer than I intended. "This goes beyond that. This is loyalty. This is brilliance." He finally met my gaze, and in his quiet gray eyes, I saw years of unspoken dedication, not just to the company, but to me. "My loyalty has always been to you, Sophia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in my heart. The choice I had been struggling with wasn't between the captain and the poet. It had never been about them. The choice was whether to acknowledge the quiet, steady, brilliant man who had been by my side all along. "I know," I said, "and mine to you." The public announcement had been my idea, my final decisive move in a game I had decided to win on my own terms. My aunt, once revived, was apoplectic. She and my uncle cornered me as Marcus was gathering his papers. "Your secretary," Beatrice shrieked, her voice still trembling. "Sophia, have you lost your mind? What will society say? He's so plain. He's a functionary." For years, a comment like that from her would have stung, would have made me question myself. But something had solidified within me during those 6 months of chaos. I looked my aunt directly in the eye, my voice calm and unyielding. "Aunt Beatrice," I said, "that plain functionary is the most brilliant man I have ever known. He just saved 2 divisions that you and Uncle Philip were ready to applaud straight into bankruptcy. His mind is sharper than any captain's cutlass and more beautiful than any poet's verse. I am not marrying a man for the society pages. I am marrying a partner. This company and my life will be better for it. This conversation is over." I had never set such a firm boundary with them before. They stared at me, speechless, as I turned and walked out of the boardroom, Marcus at my side. We didn't look back. The next day, Marcus Cole walked into the office, not as my secretary, but as the chief operating officer. He led the morning strategy meeting, and the same staff who had barely noticed him for years now hung on his every word. He was the same calm, competent man, but now his authority was recognized. The quiet engine of Kingston Global Trading had finally been moved from the background to the helm. A few years can change everything. Kingston Global Trading, under our joint leadership, became more successful and more stable than it had ever been, even under my father. Our partnership was seamless. I was the visionary, the one who saw the horizon, and Marcus was the master strategist who charted the course, ensuring every contingency was planned for, every detail managed. We were a perfect team, in the boardroom and at home. The two divisions that had been on the brink of collapse were now two of our most profitable. Maritime logistics, under a new sensible manager who followed Marcus's plan, thrived on a diverse portfolio of routes. Artisanal imports became a model of profitable beauty, its exquisite products supported by a flawlessly efficient and cost-effective supply chain. We proved that you didn't have to choose between substance and style, you just needed a leader who understood how to balance them. As for my suitors, their stories ended as predictably as they began. Captain Valerius, using his own family's money, invested in another high-risk venture involving sunken treasure and ended up losing his ship and his reputation. He was last seen trying to charm investors for a new, even more outlandish scheme. Lysander Jones used his inheritance to open a small, exclusive art gallery that was perpetually on the verge of financial collapse, subsidized by his long-suffering family. They became what they always were: footnotes, cautionary tales of charm without substance and passion without practicality. My aunt and uncle eventually came around. Their change of heart was not born of any newfound emotional depth, but of the undeniable, ever-increasing size of their dividend checks. They began to speak of Marcus with a grudging, then a genuine respect. They boasted of his business acumen at their clubs and salons, conveniently forgetting they had once dismissed him as the furniture. It was a cynical kind of peace, but a peace nonetheless. I accepted it for what it was. Looking back, the test I devised taught me more than I ever could have imagined. I learned that bravado is just noise before a fall, and that romantic ideals are a poor foundation for an empire. The flashiest people in the room are often the emptiest. True value, true strength, lies in the quiet competence, the unwavering loyalty, the steady hand that does the work without needing the applause. My great love story wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a slow, steady burn, discovered in the margins of a spreadsheet, and the quiet understanding of a shared glance across a chaotic room. It was the realization that the greatest partnership isn't about someone who completes you, but someone who sees the world with the same clear, pragmatic eyes that you do. So that's my story, the story of how I found my partner in life and in business. It wasn't in a thrilling sea story or a beautiful sonnet, but in the quiet, undeniable truth of a well-researched report. Have you ever had a moment where you realized the quiet, steady person in the background was actually the most important one in the room? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. It's in those quiet moments, I think, that we find the most profound truths. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about navigating life's unexpected challenges. Thank you for listening to my journey today. Remember, sometimes the grandest adventures are the ones that lead you to a quiet, dependable harbor you can finally call home.